Hey guys, Zomfox here, and today we're going to be looking at the NFL 53-man rosters and seeing which USFL and which XFL players ended up making it onto the rosters. Now, just like we saw last year, just because they didn't make the opening 53-man roster doesn't mean they won't eventually make it, but being on the original 53-man roster is a very, very, very big accomplishment for a player, so let's find out. So the first thing is looking at the overall numbers. There ended up being a total of 102 different players that got signed at some point. There were 63 from the XFL and 39 from the USFL. Note the USFL had a lot of players come back from 2022, so those guys already had been scouted a lot by NFL talent and stuff like that. Now, in terms of who made it, we actually have two players, one from each league, that is currently on IR. Being on IR means you're not really taking up a roster spot, so until you get healthy, we don't know whether or not you're actually going to make it. Though we do have three players who actually made a 53-man roster, which is three times as many as just one last year, two of which came from the USFL and one came from the XFL. So let's get started with the guy that came from the XFL in Daniel Wellen. The Irishman is the first Irish-born player to be in the NFL, and I believe since 1985, and he is a punter who is going to be the starting punter of the Green Bay Packers. So as for Wellen, what he did during the year with the XFL, ended up being an all XFL punter. Now, this is a bit of a, debatable one, as Brad Wing was really good last year, as you can see also. But considering the overall ratio of in 20 punts to how many punts he had, it does show that he was still very, very good, and him and Wing were definitely two best, and he proved it during the preseason. He won his battle, as in his 6 punts, he averaged 45.5 yards, and half of those punts also went in the 20. So he is currently the only punter on the roster, meaning he is the punter and holder for the team. So congrats to him for making the roster. Then we have Brandon Aubrey. Now, Aubrey last year in the USFL in 2022 was an all-USFL kicker. This year he was not, but he was still very, very solid. Luis Aguilar ended up beating him for the all-USFL nod, and that was mainly because Aguilar had arguably the greatest game a kicker ever had in his win against the Generals, where he made 8 of 8 kicks. But even with that, it's arguable Aubrey was the best kicker, even though he had worse accuracy than Matt Conklin. His 35 of 35 extra points was insane. And during the preseason, he proved that he was pretty solid as well, even though he did only go 2 for 3 in field goals. His 8 of 9 extra points, which was what really hampered him last year in the playoffs, is a big deal. He ended up basically just kicking the whole time. Everyone knew he had the job basically when he signed his 3-year deal, and he is the only kicker on the roster, so that makes 2 players that are going to be day one starters from the spring football. And then the last one is the shocker, and that's LeBron Ray. It's mainly a shock because there was a lot of other players that performed really, really well in the preseason that ended up not getting a shot in the team, and LeBron Ray ended up doing that. He went 2 of 2 for tackles and assists to each, and then he had 1 sack in his 3 preseason games. And he ended up making the roster. He is the third in the depth chart for nose tackle. But even in his USFL season, he only had 3 sacks across the 7 games he was in, 5 solo tackles and 5 assists. So this is definitely the biggest shock. Congrats to him for making the roster, but considering guys like Austin Watkins, who was insane throughout the entire preseason, didn't make it, this was definitely a shock. So the 2 players that are on IR are Isaiah Zuber and Austin Faoliu. Both those guys are currently on the IR. So until they get healthy, we don't really know if they fully made a roster or not. So they don't really count as making the roster. We saw this with Chris Odom last year. He was on IR the whole year, and then he ended up becoming a free agent, and the Browns didn't keep him. So we'll see. So let's look at the actual numbers in terms of how good this is. So when you look at it, last year there were 51 players who got signed, and only one of them made a roster. That was Kevontae Turpin, which meant that just under 2% made the 53-man roster. Now we look at the 2023 XFL, and we see that 63 got signed, which is a huge gain compared to the first year of the USFL. But just like the USFL, only one guy made it, making it 1.6%. The worst of all 3, because the 2023 USFL saw 39 players get signed, and 2 of them made the roster at 5.1%. So that means that percentage-wise, the 2023 USFL is the best, though the 2023 XFL is the best at getting signed. What is really important about this is for spring football fans. There was a lot of talk, people who either hate on the XFL, hate on the USFL, or hate on both, saying that there's not enough talent for 2 leagues. Let this be proof that yes, there is. The fact that we had 100 plus players get signed from the 2 leagues, and the fact that we had a triple in players getting actually on the roster instead of just 1, like last year we have 3, including 2 of them being day 1 starters, That's a good thing. Any sort of improvement is still improvement. And this is showing that there is enough talent to actually supply both these leagues. So this is a really good sign. And this helps both leagues, as both leagues now have a case about getting players. If you're trying to get to the NFL, you can look at the XFL and say, hey, more players got signed. But you look at the USFL, you say, hey, they've had the most players actually stay on a roster. So we'll see how many players end up, joining 53-man rosters during the season. We'll end up seeing if any of these guys do anything. We'll see. So overall, this has been Zom Fox. If you enjoy this content, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. It'd be much appreciated. And we still have a couple predictions coming out for the NFL season. And as always, have a great night.